Is drinking raw milk safe like RFK Jr. suggests? Can you reduce a glucose spike if you eat your food in, quote unquote, the right order? I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp. I host a nutrition myth-busting podcast called Bite Back with Abby Sharp. And those are just some of the questions I tackle with qualified experts on my show. There is so much food misinformation and disinformation out there, and it can feel impossible to know what's real and what's BS. On Bite Back, my goal is to help listeners create a pleasurable relationship with food, their body, and themselves, which in my opinion is the fundamental secret to good health. Listen to Bite Back wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
We've all been there. You go on your computer, you start searching for a flight, but then you realize you only have a couple of options. And you go to the checkout, and your jaw drops over the price. In fact, sometimes it's cheaper and easier to fly to Europe than within our own country. Well, Canada's competition watchdog is hoping to change that. The Competition Bureau has conducted a market study on the airline sector, and it's now released a report called Cleared for Takeoff: Elevating Airline Competition. The report makes a series of recommendations to governments aimed at increasing competition in the industry to give you more options and less pain in the wallet. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, we're diving into this report. I'm speaking with Brad Callaghan, Associate Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Planning, and Advocacy with the Competition Bureau. Thank you very much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here today.
Give our listeners an idea what the current status is right now of competition in the airline industry in Canada. Why is it a problem for consumers?
It's concentrated. The report really kind of highlights that flying in Canada is a concentrated sector. So most flights are controlled by two major carriers, Air Canada and WestJet. And we know that it's a difficult market to break into. So for new players, there's barriers that make it difficult to enter here and expand. There's unique challenges for specific communities like remote and northern parts of Canada. But the good news is that competition works. We've got a key finding from this study today that introducing just one more carrier on a route in Canada would decrease prices by 9% on average. So there's certainly encouraging signs as well.
Let's go back a little bit. How much of the market share is just WestJet and Air Canada? How much do they actually dominate air travel in our country?
Well, it's certainly concentrated. If you think about travelers flying out of the busiest airports in Canada, together, Air Canada and WestJet control somewhere between 56 and 78% of those flights. So it's a concentrated sector, and we know that it can be difficult for new carriers to come in. We've made 10 recommendations in our study today to try to address those issues. They range from things like prioritizing competition in aviation policy, leveraging international capital and expertise, and also specific recommendations for northern and remote communities.
Okay, so just before we move on to the recommendations in the report, you talked about the roadblocks for new airlines to enter the market or existing low-cost or other airlines aside from Air Canada, WestJet. What are those roadblocks? Why is it so challenging for new or smaller airlines to take off?
There's a number of challenges in Canada. Some of these barriers are outside of our control. They have to do with how spread out Canada's population is in a vast country. But we think there's opportunities to address a number of the other ones. Things like the fees that go into an airline ticket. Most travelers are paying about 30 cents on the dollar for fees that go into those tickets. And that those can really impact entrants even more, in particular, the ultra low-cost carriers who have been trying to make entry here in Canada. Other barriers are things like airport access and restrictions on foreign investment. So we've got recommendations on how to try to address these things to encourage more entrants and bring more competition here in Canada in the airline sector.
So let's dive into that a little bit more on what you're hoping the government does. It seems like the big recommendation is around that foreign ownership aspect. So what changes are you looking for the feds to do there?
Yes, leveraging international capital and expertise is a big part of our recommendations. We know that there is a need here in Canada for more investment in new entrants so that they can establish here and grow, and that the current restrictions on those investments from other countries is having an impact. So what we've recommended is a few things. One is to increase the limit on foreign investment from a single investor to 49%. The other is looking specifically at city to city travel within Canada. And there we are recommending up to 100% investment from foreign investors. So people could imagine a category of carrier there where it's a Canadian company respecting Canadian laws, a Canadian crew on the plane, but really that is benefiting from the foreign investment that is much needed in this country to bring more competition.
With that new category of 100% ownership, you're talking about like a separate entity or a new airline that would just focus no flights to New York, no flights to LA, Portugal, whatever else, just within Canada. Could you see that be like a different division of an existing airline, like let's say Porter, WestJet, or Air Canada, creating a new sort of low-cost option that's within that attracts even more foreign investment so that they could get that off the ground? Is that something you're looking for, or are you looking only at new players entering the market?
Well, what we're really looking at is new areas of investment. So we did not go into detail in terms of which carriers would be able to roll out those kinds of offerings. It's about getting competition to benefit from those sources of investment if we can reduce those barriers to investment. So we really think there's a lot of opportunity here. We know other countries have benefited from models like this. Australia, for example, would be a country that can be looked to that has shown success and entry. Obviously, not without challenges. I think all countries are looking closely at the role that competition plays because even despite some encouraging signs here in Canada, we know that progress is fragile. So that's why we've really focused hard on these recommendations. And we think foreign investment is a big part of it.
Could there also be a risk with foreign investment in a way? Because, we've seen some industries where foreign investors or hedge funds come in and buy a property that's well known in Canada and then slowly start to peel it away in order to make profit off of a company as it's going down. It's something that does happen. Would there have to be safeguards to prevent that from happening? How would you stop that?
Our focus in this study is really about the potential that it can bring for competition, competition. And we think that it really would be positive. There are structures in place in order to review those kinds of investments already. The Investment Canada Act would be one, a system where there's a parallel review by proposed transactions so that the industry minister can look at effects, economic effects, but also security effects if necessary. But really, from our perspective, it's about motivating more competition. We know that there is a desire and a need for more sources of investment and expertise, and we think that lowering some of these restrictions on foreign investment can be beneficial.
Now, one argument we've heard, because this is not a new conversation in Canada, this has been going on for decades, but one argument that we've heard is that the big airlines kind of use major routes and the prices that they get from that to sort of help subsidize the smaller routes that they take to smaller or remote communities. I know you were discussing a little bit of that earlier, but is there not a risk that we could see diminished routes to those smaller or remote communities if we see competition sort of increase and focus may turn to something that's a little bit more stable around those major hubs for business?
It's an excellent consideration. It's one that we discuss in our report. Obviously, that's not the goal from our recommendations. We're looking to increase competition on all of these routes. I would note we mentioned that more competition is not always about having more than one carrier. There may very well be routes in the remote or the northern communities that you mentioned that can only support one carrier. But the role of competition there is just as important. And that's because the threat of entry really matters. If there is a monopolist on those routes, they really kind of focus their attention if they know that there is another entrant who's waiting in the wings, ready to displace them with a better offer, something that's more competitive. So we need to make sure that even in those markets, that the conditions for competition are there.
I was going to ask you about the savings that Canadians could see from the changes you're proposing, but I think you mentioned that earlier. 9% was it that Canadians might save through these changes?
Yes, it's a really important finding from our study. We know competition works. This is not a surprise to us, but now we have the data from this report to back it up. Adding just one more competitor on a route in Canada can deliver a 9% reduction in the price of those flights on average. So that's just looking at price. Obviously, competition goes to a whole lot more than that. The range of services that people can expect when they're flying on these routes, as well as a host of other things, new innovations that might come from the airlines, better flight schedules, a range of other offerings. So really, it goes more than beyond price.
More on the big story in just a moment with Brad Callaghan, Associate Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Planning and Advocacy with the Competition Bureau, talking about making our airline industry more competitive. What about airport exclusivity? It's something that's addressed in the report that you've also sort of touched on earlier in our interview. What's the problem there? How many airports have these exclusivity clauses, and why is that a problem?
So this is really about the role that smaller airports can play in cities that might have more than one. Are they able to kind of bring some competition to a bigger, more established airport known as a hub airport? We highlight the effects of one issue in our study, which is in Montreal, and competition there between the smaller local airport. We highlight an exclusivity arrangement that basically prevents the smaller airport in Montreal from flying internationally. There's a number of effects there, but it boils down to effects that really make it harder for airlines to offer competitive flights out of these smaller secondary airports. So it's an important thing to be paying attention to, and we've encouraged regulators to take a close look at whether they're the most helpful for competition.
Do you think airports have the capacity to handle an increase of an extra even one or two carriers if all of a sudden there are a bunch of new flights being added on at the moment? I assume that that's sort of worked into your change on exclusivity that you're calling for. But let's say those exclusivity issues are not addressed. Do they have the capacity to handle new flights like this?
Well, capacity is certainly an important consideration, and we're not suggesting that any airports take on more than they can handle. The key thing is the role of competition. Even when there are limited or just one airline flying out of those airports, knowing that there are no barriers to entry means that an airline flying at that airport will feel the forces of competition. They'll know that the next competitor is waiting in the wings, pushing them to drive for better offerings, lower prices, better services to their passengers. So even in those situations where capacity is limited, competition is essential.
You want to make changes to the way the federal minister handles things like mergers and collaboration and the power that they have. Explain what changes you're looking for.
Yes, we're looking to strengthen the merger review process as it works for airline mergers and competitor collaborations in Canada. Currently, the way that works is quite unique for merger reviews compared to other sectors. In the case of airline transactions, the Competition Bureau really becomes more of an advisor to the Minister of Transport. We would review the transaction as we would for all other mergers in Canada to see if it's going to harm competition. But rather than being able to go to a court, the competition tribunal, to challenge a merger, we instead make a report to the Minister of Transport, and the decision lies with the Minister of Transport to decide on a public interest review, considering a host of other factors, whether the transaction would go ahead or not. Our recommendation is to prioritize the role of competition, to do away with this carve out for specifically airline reviews and go to something more along the lines of a parallel review system. We think that would really encourage, prioritize the role of competition, and it would make sure that anti-competitive mergers are not allowed to proceed in Canada.
Out of all of the recommendations you make in this report, how quickly could Canadians potentially see these changes happen if the federal government decides to act on them? Is this a matter of just regulatory changes? Will it require legislation, or is it a mix of both?
Well, we really look forward to engaging with policymakers. We hope we can do that very soon. Competition will take time, and these will require changes. It's a host of things. Some would require, if they are adopted, changes to laws and regulations. But we're willing to take the time to work with regulators to try to explain our findings and to find out where solutions are possible. I will say there is a real need for more competition in Canada. Airlines is a great example, so we're certainly motivated to push these ahead and see what potential there is. But we're also willing to engage and have meaningful discussions with policymakers about what we can do.
All right, Brad, thanks so much for joining me to explain the findings of this report and explain it for our listeners as well.
Thanks so much for having me on and highlighting our airline market study. It was a pleasure.
That was Brad Callaghan with the Competition Bureau speaking with me about a new market study and report from the Bureau that basically calls for more foreign ownership in our airline sector to try and increase competition and lower prices for air travelers. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your other favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.